Gen Z has 41 million eligible voters. It's the largest voting bloc in America.
Being surrounded by so many other passionate individuals that are all young.
Vice President Kamala Harris has been successful at energizing young voters online.
I would have a beer with her. I like her. She seems interesting.
And former President Donald Trump's popularity has grown amongst young men.
He's a winner, he's a fighter, and he's going to take down Kamala.
But will this popularity translate to engagement come November? We discuss this tonight on Decision 2024, Young Voters. Welcome to Decision 2024, Young Voters. My name is Amrit Singh, and in the past 2 years alone, Gen Z voters have grown by 8 million people, becoming 1/5 of the American electorate. It's a voting bloc that could determine the outcome of the presidential election and swing some hotly contested races around the country and right here in California. Question is, how do we reach them? To start, it's important to understand the issues that matter the most to young voters. Taylor Turagana spoke to young voters about the issues that are top of mind when it comes to this election.
If the future is in the hands of the next generation, 19-year-old Ashi Jawar says they're well equipped to handle the changing times. She's the co-executive director for Voters of Tomorrow, a Gen Z-led organization that civically engages and empowers young voters.
Civic engagement and progressive policy is really the forefront of all change.
She and the team of teenagers are assembling voter registration kits for local high schools and community colleges. Ashi says she was motivated to get involved after dealing with chronic illnesses that she says revealed how many disparities and systemic issues exist within the healthcare system.
Being part of this movement and being surrounded by so many other passionate individuals that are all young, realizing that we can write policy, we can have voter registration drives, we can turn out people to vote.
As the daughter of 2 Vietnamese refugees, 19-year-old Zion Tran says immigration policies are top of mind, along with the environment.
We're looking at a climate disaster that's ahead of us, especially for young people. I mean, we're the next generation, and we want to make sure that the earth is sustainable for future generations to live in, and also reproductive health, especially women's rights.
These are the top issues driving this generation.
Notice how I'm pre-registering
and registering
to vote? Very cutesy.
UCLA professor Veronica Tarica says as the director of the Chicano Studies Research Center, she's conducted extensive research on youth voting trends that reveal young voters are motivated by environmental justice, health, and education.
Gen Z cares about their communities, and when provided the proper information about how elections matter to their everyday lives, to the lives of their families, their communities, they vote.
This is seen across the age and socioeconomic spectrum, she says. And even though 15-year-old Prahi Shah can't vote yet, she's proud to make a difference at that local level.
I never thought that I would get the chance to go to the Capitol in Sacramento and actually have a chance to have meetings with all of these various representatives and discuss policy that is actually relevant to what I believe in.
They're laying the groundwork, says Ashi, in hopes of creating a better tomorrow.
For a generation like ours, it's really daunting to go out into the world knowing that we can't really afford things anymore. So I think there's a lot of issues that are at stake, and hopefully that those issues are what's going to bring us to the polls.
Harnessing the political power of Gen Z that could decide elections and legislation.
Very professional. Very demure.
No doubt the economy top issue for voters across the board, but how do they view these issues compared to older generations? To help answer that question, we have Steve Kaplan, instructor at the USC Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism, also a strategist, a person who's run campaigns. You've thought a lot about these demographics, Steve.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me today.
It's great to have you. And if we think about these young voters, everyone wants to understand their beliefs, who they are. We see in PPIC polling since 2006, they've shifted a little bit to the left in their attitudes, beliefs, and also identification with the Democratic Party. I mean, tell us more about them, their beliefs.
Sure. I mean, young voters for many years have been moving towards the Democratic Party, have certainly become an audience that Democrats could count on. The question is that level of commitment, just how enthusiastic they are and the level of support that those young voters have towards the nominees on both parties. And what we've seen is really a remarkable turnaround just in this last month.
I know Republicans want the answer to this question. What's motivating this somewhat leftward shift that we see showing up in the data?
Yeah, I think that younger voters have less concerns about government involvement in making a difference in people's lives. overwhelmingly, they look at things like immigration, they look at issues around criminal justice, not as negatives in as much of a sense, but as almost positives. And you see that with issues like immigration, you see that with issues like criminal justice, and we've seen that recently in the last several years with some of the incidents that have occurred across the country that have motivated and inspired young people in different ways.
In this PPIC polling we've been talking about, they looked at the way that people are identifying with these parties versus identifying with these issues and saying there's some disconnect between folks that are claiming to be Republican and their actual beliefs. In other words, young voters are thinking differently between labels and the issues themselves. What do you think is behind that, and what more could we do to understand that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that most young voters don't immediately subscribe or think of themselves with a party label. They think of themselves as activists and advocates on a number of issues. So they're less bound to party affiliation than many generations previously have been. So whether you want to change that or not, I'm not sure that is a challenge. It's certainly a challenge for the political parties to keep and capture those young voters and make them loyal Democrats or loyal Republicans. But I think young people now are less tied to these labels that many of us have been used to for many years.
And when you talk about keep and capture, of course, we're talking about attracting people to parties. And here's the billion-dollar question for a guy like you, for the campaigns that are watching. How do candidates, parties, issue-oriented people approach young voters in a way that feels authentic and might actually bring them to their cause?
Well, you know, every cycle and every 4 years, we see a different platform, at least since 2000, that is used to attract and retain voters. And we've seen it change just in 2016. Look, the President Trump campaign, his successful campaign, was based largely on his work on Twitter and the things he did on Twitter, using that platform to its maximum effect. It's 8 years later, and there's different platforms now. And it appears that whether it's the Democrats or more organically, young people have flocked to platforms like TikTok and other multimedia type platforms to share their vision and their thoughts about the candidates. It's really the most striking thing that's occurred in this election. And it's unlike anything we've ever seen, because now you've got different platforms that are being used, not by the campaigns necessarily, but as I said, organically meaning by users who generate their own content.
Yeah.
And in the case of Kamala Harris, it really was a remarkable pre-buttal almost to what we would have expected to see coming out of the gates.
You talk about platforms and social media. There's a lot to talk about there, but there's also just the language, right? And the optics. Outside, agnostic of platform, but the way you talk to a voter. Are there any best practices around that? Anything that we see that particularly resonates when people are approached with political messaging?
Yeah, I think the one thing that marketers and political candidates need to keep in mind is authenticity is everything with this generation. They're very skeptical of voices that they see as inauthentic. And it's a real challenge for a marketer too, because when you try and ride that wave of something that's organic and put your own stamp on it, it can backfire.
It does come down to communication in so many ways, and I think there's more to talk about with you there, Steve. We'll get to that. After the break, what young voters are doing to reach others their age, and how the state's trying to engage this demographic at an early age. We'll be right back. According to the Center for Inclusive Democracy, registered Gen Z voters would have been enough to flip races in battleground congressional districts in the 2022 midterms. Enough of these districts exist in California to impact the balance of power in the House of Representatives. Taylor Schaub spoke to two young party leaders about their efforts to influence down-ballot races.
Knocking on doors sometimes feels like a full-time job for Adam Tayabas, but these days, he wouldn't have it any other way.
I'm using an app that tells me where my neighbors are and what their voter registration is, just so I can talk to them.
As the head of the Orange County Young Democrats, Adam is driving from neighborhood to neighborhood, determined to make every conversation count.
I love knocking doors, and I can go all day.
Adam says the switch from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket has particularly engaged the younger, diverse voters.
They see a presidential ticket that looks like them.
He says while the campaign's savvy use of social media has reeled them in, it's the power of personal connection that will get them to vote. So he's laser focused on reaching out face to face.
I think it's an age group that is politically not really catered to.
Putting the fire to our local electeds is what we must do to win in November.
On the other side, Ariana Osemacher, chair of California's Young Republican Federation, is also pushing a multi-pronged strategy using social media, open events, and yes, still most importantly, canvassing.
Door knocking is an old-fashioned way to a lot of people, but it allows individuals to dispel things that they may have heard.
Ariana's not just thinking about the presidential race. For her, it's the local battles in California that really matter. She says young Republicans are using the energy from the top of the ticket to fuel several key congressional races in Orange County and the Central Valley, along with some other smaller races.
Our city council, our school board, our county supervisors affect our day-to-day life and have a bigger impact than, say, the president and the vice president of the United States.
Political professor Matt Lasegna says both parties know the youth vote is crucial, with Gen Z making up a fifth of the electorate this year, according to the Tufts Center for Civic Learning and Engagement.
The age with the lowest participation rates tends to be 18 to 35.
There's a 20-year-old Democrat in this House.
Like his Republican counterpart, Adams determined to change that by driving energy into local races, especially in tightly contested Orange County.
We have so many seats from Congress down to local city councils and water boards that really affect our daily life.
With both parties blending tech with old school tactics, the focus is on getting this vital voting bloc to the polls.
18 states and Washington, D.C. have taken a step forward in encouraging young civic participation by allowing voters to pre-register as early as age 16. Jamie Kennedy tells us more about the efforts to engage voters from an early age.
Creating voting awareness art with friends might not be every young person's idea of fun, but for 17-year-old Anushka Kalyan, she says she loves it.
So we called it like an artivism event, and we're making just a couple of like bracelets and different things that we're coloring.
The high school senior says even though she can't vote, she wants to encourage other young people who can. Anushka says she wishes more civic education would happen at schools so younger people may be more inclined to vote and be civically involved.
Overall, it's, at least in my school, it's not the norm to talk about voting or be excited about things like that, but I wish it was like that though.
Adults aged 18 to 34 make up 31% of the state's voting population, but only 18% of likely voters, according to the Public Policy Institute of California, which is a stark comparison to those 55 and older who make up 35% of the voting population, but 50% of likely voters. Sacramento County Superintendent of Schools David Gordon is one of those pushing for more civic education across the state. He says he would like civic education to start earlier than in high school.
Our younger people are being exposed to sophisticated ideas on the internet, on the social media earlier and earlier, and they have absolutely got to understand how our government works.
Another way state leaders are engaging young people is pre-registering them to vote. Since the state began allowing it in 2016, the Secretary of State's office says over 1 million 16 to 17-year-olds have pre-registered, with the current total sitting around 131,000. In Sacramento County, Ken Kasparis with the County Elections Office says they have roughly 5,300 pre-registered and are working to have more sign up.
We do what we call high school mock elections. So we go out into the community and as many high schools as we can get out to. This year we're doing 17 of them, and we essentially introduce them to elections.
Anushka says she is pre-registered to vote, but only knew it was an option through getting a driving permit.
I did know that only because I had a few friends tell me about like how to register for your permit. And they walked me through the questions. That's kind of the only reason why I knew.
Pre-registering is now something Anushka says she openly talks about and hopes she and her friends can inspire others to be more civically minded.
When we come back, the role that social media plays in politics and how it could be a vehicle to reaching young voters. According to a recent Pew study, almost half of TikTok users from the ages of 18 to 29 use the app to keep up with politics or political issues. 45% of that group also think that TikTok and its political content is mostly good for democracy. Chase Beach spoke to a political influencer and explains the role that TikTok's playing in this election.
Okay, so boom. We was mad at Big T for being cool with Big
It's politics in a Gen Z format. That's A.B. Burns-Tucker's specialty. The 35-year-old is a content creator and law student, and she's always ready to record
everything that a creator could need.
Her videos cover different aspects of politics, and right now, the upcoming election is her focus.
Which I love because this is like my Super Bowl season.
A.B. regularly posts videos like this, explaining to her audience what's happening in the world of politics. She considers herself to be an independent voice, but always has some editorial flair.
Country for me to go ahead and shake the spot. And
this TikTok has over 11,000 likes. A.B. says that's why she started posting, to get younger people more engaged.
I realized, like, oh, there's a whole audience of people who might be not informed or misinformed, right? Because they don't necessarily understand the language of politics.
And major political players are taking note. This year, A.B. and over 200 other influencers and content creators were credentialed at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. They were given special access to the convention floor.
Representative will stand to say the great state of Minnesota gives X number of delegates to Harris Walls.
For some creators in attendance, the DNC was an opportunity to share their own messages with politicians. Carlos Eduardo Espina is an influencer with over 10 million TikTok followers. He says he was there to talk about immigration.
And not just as a Democrat value, but as a Republican value as well. I mean, look at Ronald Reagan's last speech as president. He talked about the importance of immigration. And that's really the message I've sent on social media for the past 4 years that I think has resonated with so many Latinos, so many immigrants here in the United States.
According to recent polling from Pew Research Center, 48% of people aged 18 to 29 use TikTok to keep up with political news. Shea Crowder is assistant professor of political science at Loyola Marymount University, and she studies how social media can impact political behavior.
People are not, subscribing to the news or even reading the news in the same way that they have historically. And so it's really important, if you want to get that message to reach certain people, to have that information put out through social media.
She says Gen Z and millennials want to hear from individuals they trust, like A.B.
I'm really honored to kind of play that medium and be that resource.
The new news and attention political parties are vying for in the palm of her hand.
Back with us to talk about the online social media of it all is Steve Kaplan, instructor at the USC School for Communications Journalism, also campaign strategist, a person who understands this stuff well. So when I say internet online, you think?
I think digital. I think about my cell phone that's not in my pocket right now.
That's right. And that's exactly where people are living, on that cell phone that's usually attached to people's hands.
Correct.
And especially young folks on these phones. I mean, it's one of the ways in which campaigns are trying to reach them, right?
Absolutely. And we talked about a little bit earlier. I mean, not to give you a history lesson here, but it wasn't that long ago that there were 3 major networks that were responsible for almost all the advertising, at least broadcast, that Americans saw. As an advertiser, as a marketer, as a political candidate, you would know who was watching a show at a certain time. You'd buy that TV ad and boom, there they would be. Must-see TV, you buy friends, and you have an audience. Now that audience in the media environment is so dispersed that you have to find the voters where they are. Young voters are living on their phones, they're living in digital, and frankly, they're changing platforms even more quickly. So it's really about the platform, but also the message. What are you saying and how are those platforms being used? And it is, I would say, a bit of a trick. Look, the Harris campaign has a fully operational digital team. My understanding is that they have a half dozen folks running that who are under the age of 25. For many years, giving that kind of power to people who weren't particularly seen as experienced professionals would have been a risk that most campaigns would be afraid to take. Can't say that now.
Absolutely. And when it comes to young voters who are digital natives coming up in this environment, what do you see that's resonating with those voters in this way?
Well, certainly, it's one of the more interesting examples of a successful social media campaign or platform was the use of the coconut meme. This is a remarkable moment where, quite frankly, a candidate style that may have been seen as a quirk or a challenge, and I'm sure many GOP consultants were thinking, oh, we're going to get her on some of the way she talks, the style that she uses, the laugh. Sure enough, organically, those issues and those challenges were met with memes that took off like wildfire and showed her as a human being, being very human.
One last question is a question everybody's wondering. You see the enthusiasm for both these campaigns online. How do the campaigns translate that enthusiasm into people actually going and filling out a ballot?
Well, it's the million, or in this case, $17 billion question, because that's how much is going to be spent on political advertising this year. Among young voters, look, in 2022, I believe the voter turnout was something like 25% of young voters, as opposed to 63% of older voters. That gap almost always exists. It's one thing to get people engaged and encouraged and excited. It's a whole other thing to get them to the polls, and that will be a challenge. So we'll see how that goes.
Translating enthusiasm into votes has always been the issue, and it exists even in the digital space. Steve Kaplan, thanks so much for your expertise. Great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. There is no doubt young people could decide the 2024 presidential election, but our country has one of the lowest rates of youth voter turnout in the world. So, come November, will it be the same story? We'll find out together. My name is Amit Singh. Thank you for watching, and whatever your age, be sure to get out there and vote.